I want to talk about the politics of Jesus, but I need to make a few disclaimers. First of all, by talking about the politics of Jesus, I'm not trying to be trendy. It's not like I've gone through my old university notes on Karl Marx and I've decided to reinvent Jesus in my own image. I don't think it's particularly fashionable. The point I'm making, and we'll explore this in a moment in the Gospel of Mark, is that the very heart of the ministry of Jesus is political. Now, by political, I don't mean party politics. I don't mean he's trying to, compete with others simply for the sake of power, but because of his concerns of compassion and love. That leads him inevitably into the political realm. Because of his great compassion, especially for the poor, then for him there was no other option of being political. So when I say the politics of Jesus, or that Jesus is political, this is not an add-on. It's not a superficial addition to how we interpret it. But it lies at the very heart of his ministry, because he was concerned especially about poverty. He wanted to address the politics that exploited the poor and that sustained poverty in order that there may be justice. So a consequence of this line of thinking is that justice too is not an optional extra. Justice is the outcome of Christianity in practice. Justice is a measure of the integrity of the faith. Without justice, then there is no Christian faith in practice. So, with this in mind, let's explore the Gospel of Mark. Now, to some degree, the four Gospels of the New Testament all explore these themes in different ways. The Gospel of Mark is the first Gospel written, and it's worthwhile noting when it was written, because that gives you an insight into the politics of Jesus and his concern for justice. So if Jesus was crucified around the year 29, the Gospel of Mark was written or compiled for an audience around the year 69, some 2 generations. Of course, there would be some changes since the time of Jesus, but basically many of the main social and political structures were still in place. Now, some key things to remember here when we're talking about context is that, first of all, this is in the province of Judea, which is a client state of Rome. So ultimately, the Romans are in charge. So various appointments, various Jewish figures are appointed by Rome, like the chief priest or the chief tax collector. So as a client state, they had vested interests in serving Roman interests. And in that context, the temple itself was a vehicle for Roman power and the maintenance of the Pax Romana. So the first and critical fact is that Judea is under Roman rule. And in this particular period, from the year 66 to 70, there are various Jewish groups who are in outright conflict with Rome. Prior to that period, there have been various prophetic movements or social bandits, but this came to a head in the years 66 to 70. So here we have the Gospel of Mark telling the good news of Jesus. It's under the shadow of Rome. It's during a period of great conflict. Now, one final thing, and that's about the audience. The Gospel of Mark is very concerned to address the needs of the ordinary person. In the ancient world at that time, arguably some 95% of the people were poor, some of them incredibly poor, landless peasants. And so poverty is a huge issue. And in a moment when we have closer look at the Gospel of Mark, you'll see, notice the importance of the crowd or the gathering of the people. These are the poor people. In terms of the religious institutions, there was a particular practice, what we often refer to as the purity code. That's where things and people are sorted essentially into two boxes, holy and unholy, clean and unclean. And within the religious institution itself, it's taken a step further because there are gradations of who is more holier than others. And the religious system of that time actually accentuated the poverty and social justice of that time. So the bulk of the people, the landless peasants especially, and even more so women and children, were dispossessed. They were completely marginalised. And that process of marginalisation was not only reinforced, it was exacerbated by religious institutions. Now, when we actually look at the Gospel of Mark, remember, it's written in a dramatic style, and sometimes the Jewish leaders are presented as caricatures. But they're presented in that way to make a particular contrast. They're trying to make a point. So that's the context. This is when the Gospel of Mark is being compiled and proclaimed to living communities of people, and it's bringing good news. And the good news is that Jesus, whom we follow, is passionately concerned about the poor. For Jesus' concern about poverty is not, an intellectual dalliance. He comes with a deep sense of compassion for those who are poor, and he is outraged by poverty. And he is going to challenge in a very explicit way the poverty and the political structures and social structures that maintain and exacerbate the situation of poverty. Remember, one final caveat is that in the end, Jesus is crucified by the Romans because he was regarded as a political subversive. Now, there's a particular story that I want to focus on today that brings these themes out and which emphasise the extent to which Jesus put into practice his politics, his politics of compassion, his politics of justice. And it's in Mark chapter 3 verses 20 to 35. It's like a sandwich of stories. There's an interaction with his family at the beginning of the story. They think he's crazy. And already that alerts us to a number of things. The radical nature of the ministry of Jesus and how that even brings a kind of dissent or conflict within his own family system, that he has other loyalties. His focus is on the compassion of God and this politics of justice. And of course the story concludes with a segment. This is the other part of the sandwich, the two pieces of bread, if you like, where Jesus clarifies that his priorities aren't to his family. And remember, this is in a culture where kinship was at a premium. He clarifies that that's not where his ultimate loyalties lie. Now, in between, there's a fascinating little a story where some of the tensions that I've alluded to, the tensions between the poor, the common people, and the political and religious structures that work against the poor, they're played out. And they're played out using the ancient mythology of the world. And it begins with various leaders trying to undermine the ministry of Jesus, saying, well, what's the source of the authority of this Jesus? What is his relationship with the figure of Satan? And now I'm underlining here too that these are mythological figures. They don't make sense They don't exist in our postmodern era, but in the ancient world, it's part of the way that people saw, it's their cosmology, it's the way of the world. But what is interesting is as Jesus handles this challenge to his authority, he turns this cosmic mythology back on the leaders. And he does this by just a little story, verse 27, where he talks about entering the strong man's house. And there is an implied threat here that Jesus is going to enter the strong man's house and bind him. He's going to overthrow the strong man. Now, there are other references to the strong man in the Gospel of Mark. And the strong man becomes a symbolic figure, not simply of the Jewish leaders who reinforce and exacerbate the condition of poverty and the plight of the poor, but also of the Roman leaders. So here we have, in a sense, the underbelly of the ministry of Jesus. This is the guts of his ministry. This is the visceral element. He is serious about God's concern for the poor. He is serious about compassion for those who suffer. And he is taking this so seriously, he is going to challenge the very power and the status of the strong man. Which brings us now back to the 21st century. At the moment, we just have to cast a look around and we see, the issues of poverty are only getting worse. The rich are getting richer. Even in terms of the pandemic, and who gets the jab is determined by issues of political and social structures and questions of poverty. We only have to think of the countless groups that are marginalised in Western culture, the queer community, women, the gender pay gap, sexual harassment, sexual violence against women, the marginalisation of children. And when we extend that horizon a bit more, think of all the marginalised groups like the Uyghurs in China, the Rohingya in Myanmar, the Western Papuans in Indonesia, and in Australia, our own First Nations people. So the issue of poverty is not a peripheral issue, it is a major issue. And from a Christian perspective, it's the only game in town. From a Christian perspective, if we profess that our understanding of God or the divine is of love and compassion, then of course we're going to become politically engaged. And political engagement in the Gospel of Mark is risky. It calls us to be willing to sacrifice, to take up our own cross, to risk our own lives in the name of love. The politics of Jesus means, for the sake of the poor and in the name of love, we willingly take up our position of resistance against the strong men of our time. Jesus is political, not in a trendy or affected way, but as a natural and deep expression of his compassion for the poor. And what that means is that he has an incredible sense of courage about his mission. And this mission, then, is an invitation for us too, to take some risks, to place ourselves in uncomfortable positions, and to act with compassion and justice. Justice is the beginning, the end, and the measure of all things Christian. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen.